Jericho was not just an ordinary city. It was a symbol of power, wealth, and arrogance. With its impregnable walls, luxurious palaces, and thriving commerce, it seemed that nothing could ever threaten its existence. Yet behind all that ostentation lay a dark side that few dared to question. Pagan rituals, rampant idolatry, and a system that exploited the most vulnerable, especially women, were part of the daily reality in this forbidden city. It was believed that to ensure prosperity and divine favor, sacrifices had to be made. And often, those sacrifices involved people. Imagine living in a place where your life is worth no more than a silver coin, where your existence can be dictated by a corrupt king or by priests practicing perverse rituals in the name of fertility. Jericho's walls protected the city from external enemies, but they could not conceal the decay growing within. Women were treated as objects, offered up in temples to serve as instruments of worship, with no voice, no choice, no hope. But what happens when a city that considers itself invincible dares to defy the authority of the true God? What happens when those who trust in their own luxury and power ignore the signs of their own destruction? Jericho's history is not merely an ancient tale. It is a warning to every nation, society, and individual who believes they can defy divine principles without consequence. Amid this chaotic scene, one woman did the unthinkable. While everyone trusted the walls, she saw beyond appearances. Rahab, marked by her past, envisioned a future and made a decision that would change her history forever. And it is precisely here that this narrative becomes even more intriguing. Before we continue, if you like our videos and feel that they have blessed your life, like and comment, even if it's just an amen. This makes a huge difference for this content to reach more people and impact lives. If you are not yet subscribed, take the opportunity to subscribe, activate notifications, and share with those you love. Help spread this message of faith and hope. Each like, comment, and share strengthens this work, which we do with all affection to edify your life. Together, we can reach even more hearts. Continuing. Jericho was not just a city, it was a true symbol of power and invincibility. Its walls rose an impressive 12 meters high, forming a barrier that seemed impenetrable. To any ordinary army, attacking Jericho was an absurd idea, like trying to tear down a stone fortress with one's bare hands. Every stone of those walls represented the city's confidence in its strength, its wealth, and the supposed protection offered by pagan deities. Yet history proves that no empire, however luxurious and imposing it may seem, can resist the force of divine will. After all, what is the use of an external fortress if signs of a fall are already evident from within? Jericho's defense was no trivial matter. In addition to its colossal walls, the city possessed advanced security systems for its time. Watchtowers allowed soldiers to spot enemies from miles away, and bronze doors prevented any attempted invasion. To top it off, the city had access to a supply of water, a precious resource in the desert, which made it possible to withstand long sieges. No matter how long an army waited outside for the people to surrender, Jericho's citizens could continue living without worry. This reinforced the feeling of superiority, the notion that they were above external threats. Yet there was one problem. They had forgotten that nothing can be contained by stone and bronze when divine intervention is at work. While Jericho prospered within its walls, its inhabitants indulged in luxury and ostentation while drifting away from spiritual values. The streets sparkled with opulence, palaces displayed abundant riches, and the priests performed extravagant rituals to please their pagan gods. Confidence in their own strength led the city to ignore any possibility of change. They did not believe that a group of nomads from the desert, led by a man named Joshua, could pose any threat. In the eyes of the rulers and merchants, the Israelites were merely wandering people, without a prestigious army, without military technology, without any chance against the unyielding walls. Yet history has repeatedly shown that pride precedes ruin. Outside the city, the Israelites had no sophisticated weapons or siege engines to topple the walls. What they possessed was obedience. While the inhabitants of Jericho trusted in their fortifications, the Israelites trusted in something far greater. The command was clear: march silently around the city for 6 days. On the 7th day, at the sound of trumpets and the people's shout, the walls would collapse. To human eyes, this seemed insane. Who has ever heard of an army that wins simply by marching and sounding trumpets? But that is where the great lesson lies. Divine logic often does not fit within our reasoning. Those who seek to understand biblical events solely through reason, without embracing faith, miss the true meaning behind these occurrences. Many archaeologists have attempted to explain how the walls of Jericho fell. Some speak of a possible earthquake, others suggest structural failures. Yet none of these theories can explain why the walls fell exactly at the moment when the Israelites obeyed the command. Coincidence? It is hard to believe. When we look at what has happened throughout history, we see similar patterns. Empires falling at the height of their power, entire civilizations crumbling just when they thought themselves untouchable. It is almost as if there were a hidden message in it all. Those who base their security solely on luxury and human strength eventually discover, in the worst way, that all of it is temporary. And speaking of fragile foundations, there was something within Jericho that no one dared to question. Jericho was a rare gem in the heart of the desert. While other cities struggled against drought and depended on rain for survival, Jericho had a trump card: a spring of fresh water that never ran dry. This made the city a strategic hub for commerce and survival, something as valuable as gold in that arid region. History shows that access to water has always defined the success or failure of entire civilizations. Where there is water, there is life, wealth, and power. Yet this natural advantage also brought a problem: a false sense of security. The city believed itself invincible simply because it possessed a resource that the rest of the region craved. Within the walls of Jericho, water allowed for a comfortable life. Cultivated fields, fruitful orchards, and even leisure areas for the wealthy were all nourished by it. Luxury was evident in every detail. While many nomadic peoples of the desert had to ration every drop, in Jericho there were fountains and public baths that represented status and ostentation. But there is something curious in history. Many cities that thrived because of water ended up sinking into self-sufficiency. They forgot that true security does not come from natural resources alone, but from where one places one's faith. And Jericho, unfortunately, bet everything on what could be seen and touched. The steady supply of water made Jericho a bustling commercial center. Caravans passed through to trade goods, bringing spices, fabrics, and precious metals. Merchants grew rich, and the streets were filled with merchandise from all corners of the world. However, where abundance exists, exploitation often follows, and Jericho was no different. Behind the sophisticated markets and luxurious homes lay a system of inequality that favored only a few while crushing many. While the rich bathed in marble pools, the poor struggled to survive. The legacy of Jericho was not only that of a prosperous city, but also of a place that had strayed from what truly mattered. The spring of water was also regarded as sacred. The inhabitants of Jericho performed rituals to thank their gods for the inexhaustible source. In temples decorated with gold and precious stones, the priests conducted ceremonies to ensure that the water would continue to flow. Yet there was a disturbing detail. Many of these rituals involved human sacrifices and the exploitation of women. They were offered in pagan cults as a means to please the fertility deities, a practice both shocking and common in civilizations that trusted idols rather than the true God. Curiously, this same water, which symbolized luxury and power for Jericho's residents, also silently witnessed the city's fall. When the Israelites marched around the walls, the spring continued to flow, indifferent to the unfolding events. What had once been a point of pride for the city became insignificant in the face of divine will. The power of water could not save Jericho because when one is spiritually parched, no natural source can quench the true thirst. This principle remains true to this day. It is futile to have material abundance if the soul remains arid. The lesson is clear. That which makes us feel secure today can become our greatest weakness. History is replete with examples of empires that crumbled because they trusted in their resources and ignored the signs that they were on the wrong path. Jericho had water, wealth, and fortifications, but it lacked solid spiritual foundations, and that alone was enough for its destruction. Yet what of the people within the city? Some sensed that Jericho was doomed, but few had the courage to act. And it is here that a crucial character in this narrative begins to emerge. Within the walls of Jericho, life was marked by luxury and ostentation. The bustling trade filled the cobblestone streets, where merchants displayed rare fabrics, imported jewels, and spices from distant lands. The city prospered as its rulers amassed riches, and the elite lived without worries. Yet history has shown that societies which surrender to ostentation while neglecting spiritual values are inevitably destined for a fall. Jericho trusted in the gleam of its riches, failing to realize that true stability lies not in gold or silver, but in a connection with divine purpose. The city's elite boasted of their luxurious mansions, adorned with sculptures and fine tapestries. Banquets flowed with wine, while artists and musicians performed for the privileged few. However, outside these palatial residences, inequality was glaring. The ostentation of a select few came at the expense of many. Workers lived in precarious conditions, sustaining a system that exploited their labor to maintain the splendor of the upper classes. Just as depicted in the Bible, Jericho was mired in pride, unaware that all its structures were built on fragile foundations. Money bought everything within the walls, from status and influence to a degree of impunity. The city's leaders used their positions to accumulate even more power, while the priests promoted pagan rituals to ensure that the gods continued to favor the city. Meanwhile, the people lived under a veil of illusion, believing that as long as there was abundance and security, nothing could shake Jericho. But history continually reminds us that a society that forsakes justice and righteousness is on an inevitable path to collapse. A true fortress is built not of stone, but of principles. While the streets teemed with merchants and travelers, something darker occurred in the temples. Women were handed over to the priests to partake in sacred prostitution as part of pagan cult practices believed to ensure fertility and prosperity. This practice, regarded as a way to secure divine favor, in reality only reinforced exploitation and dehumanization. The city's luxury came at a high price, paid with the dignity of those who had no choice. The false sense of grandeur blinded the inhabitants to their own decline. They deluded themselves into thinking that their prosperity was a sign of divine protection, when in truth, they were marching toward their own doom. This was not the first, nor would it be the last, time that a society crumbled by relying on its own power. The Bible is filled with similar examples: Babylon, Rome, Sodom. They all shared the arrogance of believing they were unassailable. Yet nothing built without a solid foundation endures. And Jericho would soon learn this lesson in the most dramatic way. Amidst this doomed city, there was someone who, unlike the rest, perceived what was about to unfold. A woman, scorned by society, but who saw beyond the surface. The city of Jericho appeared invincible. Its walls were high, its structure solid, and its inhabitants were confident that nothing could bring them down. Yet outside the walls, the Israelites were not preparing for an ordinary attack. They had no battering rams, catapults, or ladders to scale the walls. What they possessed was divine command. Joshua received a strategy that to human eyes seemed absurd: to march silently around the city for 6 days, and on the 7th day, at the sound of trumpets, to let out a great shout. It was obedience to this order that changed everything. For often, victory does not come from what makes sense, but from faith. Imagine the scene. Inside the walls, the inhabitants of Jericho watched the Israelites march in complete silence. On the first day, perhaps they laughed, considering it a ridiculous spectacle. On the second day, doubts began to emerge about its purpose. By the third day, uncertainty crept in like a crack in an otherwise unyielding wall. And so, the days passed, until on the 7th day, something changed. This time, the Israelites circled the city 7 times, and at the end sounded the trumpets and shouted. What happened next was unthinkable. The walls protecting the city crumbled entirely. It was not a conventional military attack, nor was it a random earthquake. It was an intervention that showed no human fortress can withstand the command of God. History proves that many have fallen by trusting more in their walls than in their spirituality. Babylon believed its walls made it untouchable, yet it was caught off guard. The Titanic was built as an unsinkable ship, but sank on its maiden voyage. Jericho followed the same path. It considered itself invincible, but ignored that its protection was merely an illusion. True strength is not in external defenses, but in the inner essence. And it was precisely this lesson that the Israelites learned. At that moment, they did not rely on human might, they relied solely on obedience. The remarkable detail of this history is that the walls did not fall by chance. The Bible recounts that they crumbled from within, not from an external assault. This means that the destruction was not caused by a human force, but by an order that came from above. The people of Jericho trusted so much in the solidity of their city that they never imagined their very ground could give way beneath them. It is always the case. When one places all one's security in something that can be destroyed, a fall becomes inevitable. And speaking of fragile foundations, there was someone within Jericho who did not place her trust in the walls or the gods of Jericho. She saw beyond the facade. Jericho, with all its wealth and power, concealed a dark reality for many women. Within the walls, some enjoyed status and privileges, yet the majority lived at the mercy of a system that exploited them without mercy. The wealthier women could marry influential leaders, wear the finest clothes, and enjoy the luxury of the city. However, for most, life was marked by submission and suffering. The priests demanded their presence in rituals devoted to pagan worship, where they were used as instruments of fertility, in practices that blended religious beliefs with exploitation. In a society where ostentation and power reigned supreme, a woman's worth was often reduced to that of an object. The temples of Jericho were notorious for their sacred prostitution rituals. Priests taught that the city's prosperity depended on these practices, and thus many women were forced to submit to an exploitative system masked as spirituality. While the powerful men engaged in business and amassed wealth, these women paid the price for that prosperity. For the rulers and religious leaders, Jericho was a city blessed by its deities, but for many women, it was nothing short of a prison. Without bars, They had no voice, no choice, and their dignity was constantly negotiated in the name of tradition. Yet, there were women who managed to wield influence within society. Some belonged to important families, participated in commerce, and even owned property. But even for them, there was a clear limit. They could never challenge the system or defy male authority. In Jericho, a woman might have wealth, but never freedom. True power belonged to the men who set the rules and decided everyone's fate. And so, while the city walls protected its citizens from external foes, inside, many women lived as prisoners of a culture that saw them merely as instruments of worship. The history of the Bible always emphasizes how God values and rescues those despised by society. And in Jericho, there was one woman who refused to accept the fate imposed on her. Her name was Rahab. Known as a prostitute, her house was strategically built upon the city wall, a passageway for merchants and travelers. In the eyes of society, she was nothing more than a sinner, but in God's eyes, her history was about to change. While the city trusted in its walls, Rahab perceived something that the powerful ignored. Those men outside were not just any army. Rahab had heard of the deeds of the God of Israel. She knew about what happened in Egypt, the crossing of the Red Sea, and the miraculous victories in the desert. Unlike the other inhabitants of Jericho, she did not mock these stories, she believed. While kings and priests banked on the city's ostentation, Rahab saw that it was all an illusion on the verge of collapse. And when the Israelite spies entered the city, she did the unthinkable. She risked her life to hide them, and in return, only asked for mercy. Rahab's courage not only saved her life, but also inscribed her into the legacy of God's people. Her name was recorded in history, and her faith turned her into an example of transformation. The fate of the women of Jericho seemed sealed, but one dared to defy the odds. And because of that, her history did not end in ruins. But how exactly did this despised woman secure a place among the chosen? The answer lies in the details of her decision. Rahab was no ordinary woman in Jericho. To society, she was merely a prostitute, someone deemed worthless, used and discarded by the men of the city. Yet history proves that God often chooses those whom the world despises to fulfill great purposes. While kings and priests place their trust in the walls and the luxury around them, Rahab perceived something that no one else saw. Jericho was doomed. The city might have appeared invincible, yet signs of its fall were everywhere. She understood that true security did not reside in the walls, but in something far greater. When the Israelite spies arrived in Jericho, Rahab saw an opportunity. Instead of betraying them, as any loyal citizen of the city would have done, she made a bold decision. She hid them in her house and helped them escape. And what is most impressive, she did it without any guarantee, relying solely on what she had heard about the God of Israel. Her faith was so immense that when speaking with the spies, she confessed that she knew the city would be destroyed. She did not ask for riches, nor did she request a privileged position among the powerful. She only asked for salvation for herself and her family. This decisive act completely changed her destiny. Rahab could have chosen to trust the system of Jericho. She could have accepted her role within that society and tried to survive. But she had the courage to break away from everything she knew and bet on something she had never seen before. She risked her life because she realized that the legacy of Jericho was not worth preserving. The city was steeped in corruption, idolatry, and exploitation. She desired something new, something authentic. And that is the difference between Rahab and the other inhabitants of Jericho. While everyone bet on the strength of the walls, she bet on the faithfulness of God. The agreement was made. The spies promised to spare Rahab and her family under one condition. She had to hang a red cord in her window as a sign for the Israelites. This image is powerful. The red cord recalls the blood on the doorposts in Egypt. When the Israelites were spared during the final plague, it also foreshadows the blood of Christ, which would bring salvation to all who believe. Rahab, a woman marked by her past, was about to be redeemed for a future she could never have imagined. God did not look at her profession, but at her faith. As Jericho crumbled, she was spared because she chose the right side before it was too late. Rahab's transformation did not end there. After the city's destruction, she joined the people of Israel and became part of the very lineage that would lead to the Messiah. Yes, that very woman, once deemed unworthy, became an ancestor of Jesus Christ. Her name entered history, not as a victim of Jericho's collapse, but as a shining example of faith and redemption. Her legacy proves that no one is bound by their past. Everyone has the chance to rewrite their history, as long as they make the right decision at the right time. What happened with Rahab teaches us a fundamental truth. God does not choose people based on the labels society assigns, but by what He sees within them. The world viewed her as a woman without value, but God saw someone willing to trust. While Jericho sank into pride and spiritual blindness, Rahab opened her eyes to reality. But what about the city's own destruction? Was it merely a natural phenomenon, or was there something more behind Jericho's fall? The fall of Jericho's walls was such an astonishing event that to this day, archaeologists and scholars continue to search for explanations. Could it have been an earthquake, a structural flaw, an incredible coincidence? History shows that great cities have fallen due to natural disasters, yet the case of Jericho stands apart. The walls fell precisely when the Israelites obeyed God's instructions. It was not a gradual collapse, nor a successful military assault. It was something that defied human logic. And when an event occurs with such precise timing, it is hard to label it as mere chance. Some archaeologists argue that the city was situated over a geological fault, and that an earthquake could have caused the destruction. Even if that were true, the central question remains: why did the earthquake occur exactly when the Israelites sounded the trumpets and shouted in victory? The probability of a natural phenomenon occurring at the precise moment of a prophecy is so minimal it verges on the impossible. Moreover, archaeological records indicate that the walls did not collapse inward, as would happen in a conventional attack, but rather outward, something that makes little sense from a structural standpoint. Other theories suggest that the noise from the trumpets and shouts might have created a resonance capable of shaking the walls. There are scientific studies on how sound waves can affect structures, but to bring down an entire city, the sound would have to be absurdly loud and precise. That would be difficult even with modern technology, let alone with ancient instruments. The truth is that all these scientific attempts fall short on one crucial point. None can explain why the walls fell exactly when God said they would. The Bible makes it clear that Jericho's fall was not a random event, but a sign of divine power. Just as the sea parted for Moses, as manna rained from the desert, and as enemy armies were defeated without Israel having to fight, this was yet another example that victory does not depend on human strength, but on obedience to God. Had the Israelites tried to conquer the city by their own means, they would have failed. But because they followed the divine strategy, they witnessed the impossible unfolding before their eyes. Regardless of scientific explanations, the fact remains that Jericho placed its trust in its walls rather than in anything else. The city was a symbol of human arrogance, a place where wealth and ostentation made the powerful feel invincible. But when God chooses to act, no wall can stand. This principle repeats throughout history. Empires have fallen when they least expected it. Civilizations have crumbled at the height of their power, all because they trusted too much in their own strength. Yet the lesson of Jericho does not end with the collapse of its walls. What followed brings even deeper insights into the true purpose behind this history. Jericho fell, but its history continues to echo through the centuries. The city that once symbolized strength and invincibility became an example that no earthly security can replace obedience to God. Its legacy is a warning to those who place their trust in luxury, power, and human fortifications. And this lesson is not limited to antiquity. It is extremely relevant today. How many people build walls around themselves, believing that money, influence, or status can shield them from adversity. But just as Jericho, sooner or later, those walls come crashing down. The story of Jericho teaches that true security does not come from amassed riches or social standing, but from a life founded on solid principles. The problem in that city was not having ostentation, but rather relying solely on it. This is the same trap many fall into today. They believe that their material achievements render them untouchable, but when life tests them, they realize they were building on sand. A true fortress is not made of stones, but of faith and integrity, and that is precisely the message that the Israelites learned that day. After all, who does not have inner walls that need to be torn down? Another powerful lesson from Jericho is the value of obedience. The Israelites won, not because they were exceptional warriors, but because they followed a plan that seemed irrational. This reminds us that often the greatest blessings come when we obey, even when we do not fully understand why. How many times has a direction from God seemed illogical? Forgiving when hurt, giving when in need, waiting when we are eager to act. It is precisely in these moments that faith is tested. Had the Israelites questioned the command and tried to bring down the walls by their own might, they would have failed. But by trusting, they witnessed the impossible happen. Jericho also serves as a warning against a spiritually corrupt society. The city was a center of idolatry, where exploitation and pagan rituals were part of daily life. The moral decline of a people always precedes their fall. The Bible shows us this time and again: Sodom and Gomorrah, Babylon, Rome. The same happens today. When a culture rejects fundamental values and replaces truth with convenience, it sows the seeds of its own destruction. Thus, Jericho was not merely a historical event, but a mirror for all future generations. And then there is Rahab. Her history proves that no matter where we come from or what we have done, there is always an opportunity for a new beginning. While Jericho sank into arrogance, she made a different choice, trusting in the true God. Perhaps this is your chance to start over, to abandon what no longer makes sense, and to build a different legacy. What would it take for you to take that step? Because in the end, who does not have walls within that need to be torn down? Jericho's history is not just a story from the past. It carries lessons that resonate even today. The city that once appeared indestructible crumbled in an instant, proving that no fortress built on arrogance and idolatry can stand forever. And this is not only true for empires and civilizations. How many times do people build their own walls, believing that their security lies in luxury, power, or total control? But when those walls fall, what remains? Jericho teaches us that true strength is not found in what meets the eye, but in what is founded on truth. The obedience of the Israelites proved that when we follow solid principles, the impossible can happen. But what about you? What kind of walls have you built up? Is there something in your life that must collapse for a new beginning to emerge? Then, there is the example of Rahab. She showed that no one is condemned by their past, and that a single right decision can completely change one's destiny. Perhaps this is your chance to start over, to let go of what no longer serves you, and to build a different legacy. What would it take for you to take that step? Now I want to hear your thoughts. Which part of Jericho's history impacted you the most? Leave your comment below. And if you want to continue learning about the mysteries and revelations of the Bible, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. See you in the next study.